On a gray Saturday morning in October of 1968, about 40 people gathered at the old Hendricks farm in Clayton County, Iowa for an estate auction. Albert Hendricks had died 3 months earlier, at the age of 87. He'd farmed the same 240 acres since 1919, and in that time he'd accumulated nearly 50 years of equipment, tools, and memories. His children had moved to the cities decades ago. None of them wanted the farm, so everything was being sold. The tractors, the implements, the hand tools, the odds and ends that fill every farm like sediment fills a riverbed. Clarence Webb arrived early, before most of the crowd. He was 34 years old, farmed 180 acres about 6 miles north, and had a reputation for 2 things: working hard and knowing metal. The second reputation came from his father, who'd been a blacksmith before the Depression killed that trade. Clarence had grown up watching his father work steel, heating it, shaping it, understanding its properties the way a musician understands notes. He'd never become a blacksmith himself, but he'd inherited his father's eye for quality metal. He could pick up a tool and tell you more about it than most people could learn from a book. That morning, while other bidders were examining the tractors and the big-ticket items, Clarence wandered over to a table piled with rusted hand tools, wrenches, hammers, chains, and blades, all of it covered in years of neglect. All of it looking like exactly what it was: the forgotten leftovers of a long farming life. Most people walked past without a second glance. Clarence stopped. He picked up a plow blade from the bottom of the pile. It was large, maybe 2 feet long, 8 inches wide, and so covered in rust that you could barely tell what it was. The kind of thing you'd throw in a scrap pile without thinking twice, but something about the weight felt different. Clarence turned the blade over in his hands. He scraped at the rust with his thumbnail, revealing a tiny patch of the steel underneath. Dark, dense. Not the gray of ordinary iron, but something deeper. He'd seen steel like this once before. In his father's shop, there'd been a chisel that his father treasured above all his other tools. Swedish steel, his father had said, made before the First War, from a recipe they don't use anymore. That chisel could cut through anything and never needed sharpening. Clarence looked at the rusted plow blade in his hands and felt the same weight, the same density. Finding any treasures? Clarence looked up. Dale Mercer, the John Deere dealer from town, was walking toward him with a cup of coffee and a smile that said he already knew the answer.
Just looking.
Dale glanced at the blade in Clarence's hands and laughed. That thing? Clarence, that's not worth the rust it's covered in. Old Hendricks hadn't used that in 20 years at least. Look at it. It's practically decomposed. It's got good weight. Weight? Dale laughed again. It's got weight because it's solid rust. Probably crumble if you tried to use it. He shook his head. If you're looking for plow blades, come by the dealership. I've got new ones. Good American steel, $45. Not this museum piece. I might just buy this one. Dale stared at Clarence for a moment, then burst out laughing. For what? $5 scrap value? Tell you what, I'll save you the embarrassment. I'll give you $5 not to bid on it. I think I'll take my chances. Dale walked away, still chuckling. Clarence heard him telling someone else about the crazy farmer who was interested in the rusted plow blade. The laughter spread. Clarence didn't care. He'd learned a long time ago that people who laugh at things they don't understand aren't worth listening to. Let me tell you about the auction, because that's where the story really begins. The plow blade came up near the end, bundled with a collection of other rusty tools. The auctioneer called it miscellaneous hand implements, sold as lot. Who'll give me $20 for the lot? Silence. 15? Nothing. $10. Come on, folks. There's good steel in here. Someone give me 10. A hand went up in the back. $10. I've got 10. Who'll give me 15? Clarence raised his hand. 15 from Clarence Webb. Do I hear 20? The other bidder shook his head. Nobody else was interested. Going once, going twice. 20. Everyone turned. Dale Mercer had raised his hand, a grin on his face. $20 from Dale. Clarence, you in at 25? Clarence nodded. 25. Dale? Dale laughed and waved his hand. 30. Just to see how high our friend here will go for a pile of rust. The crowd chuckled. This was entertainment now. Watching Clarence Webb throw money at worthless scrap. Clarence didn't hesitate. 35. Dale's smile flickered. He hadn't expected Clarence to keep going. But the joke was in motion now, and Dale wasn't about to back down. 40. 45. The crowd was quiet now. This wasn't funny anymore. This was two men in a standoff over a pile of rusty tools that nobody else would have paid $10 for. Dale looked at Clarence. Clarence looked at the blade. 50, Dale said, an edge in his voice now. 55. Dale hesitated. $60 for a pile of rust, just to prove a point? He shook his head. He's all yours, Clarence. Enjoy your expensive rust collection. The crowd laughed again, but it was nervous laughter now. Something had shifted. Clarence Webb had just paid $55, reduced to $30 after the other items were sold separately for what looked like worthless scrap, and he didn't look like a man who'd made a mistake. He looked like a man who'd found what he was looking for. Let me tell you about Clarence's father, because that's where the knowledge came from. Walter Webb had been a blacksmith in Clayton County from 1915 until 1938, when the Depression and the rise of factory-made tools finally killed his trade. In those 23 years, he'd worked with every kind of steel that passed through northeastern Iowa: American steel, German steel, English steel, and sometimes, rarely, Swedish steel. Swedish steel is different, Walter used to tell young Clarence, holding up that precious chisel. The Swedes figured out something about carbon and iron that nobody else could match. Their steel holds an edge like nothing else. You can cut through rock and it won't chip. You can work it for years and it won't dull. It's expensive as hell to make, which is why they stopped making it the old way, sometime around the First War. But if you find a piece of old Swedish steel, you hold on to it. It's worth more than gold to a man who knows how to use it. Clarence had never forgotten those words, and he'd never forgotten the feel of that chisel, the weight of it, the density, the particular darkness of the metal under the patina of age. When he'd picked up that rusty plow blade at the Hendricks auction, he'd felt the same thing. Not certainly, but possibility. The same weight, the same density, the same darkness under the rust. It was worth $55 to find out. Now let me tell you about what Clarence found when he got home. He spent 3 days cleaning that blade, not with power tools or harsh chemicals that could damage the steel, but with oil and patience and careful scraping. Layer by layer, decade by decade, he removed the rust that had accumulated since God knows when. On the 3rd day, the steel finally showed through. It was beautiful, dark and dense and perfectly smooth, with a surface that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Clarence ran his thumb along the edge and felt the bite of it, still sharp after all these years, despite the rust and neglect. Then he turned the blade over and found what he'd been hoping for. Stamped into the steel, near the base where it would attach to the plow frame, were 3 words: Sandvik, Sverige, 1890. Sandvik, the Swedish Steel Company. Sverige, Swedish for Sweden. And Clarence sat in his barn, holding a piece of steel that was 76 years old, made in a Swedish factory, using methods that hadn't been used in half a century. Steel that had somehow made its way to Iowa, been used on someone's farm, been forgotten, been buried under rust, and been dismissed as worthless by everyone except the one man who knew what to look for. $30. He'd paid $30 for this. Let me tell you about what Swedish steel could do, because that's the heart of this story. The Sandvik Company was founded in 1862 in Sandviken, Sweden. They made steel, using a process that combined exceptionally pure Swedish iron ore with precise amounts of carbon and other elements, heated and cooled in ways that created a metal harder and more durable than almost anything else available at the time. Their products were exported worldwide. Tools, blades, industrial equipment, and they were legendary for their quality. A Sandvik blade could cut through soil that would chip ordinary steel. It could work rocky ground without losing its edge. It could last for decades with minimal maintenance. But the old process was expensive. As the 20th century progressed, Sandvik moved toward cheaper, faster production methods. The steel was still good, but it wasn't the same. By the 1920s, the old-style Sandvik steel, the kind made in 1892, was no longer being produced, which meant that Clarence Webb in 1968 was holding something irreplaceable. He had two choices. He could sell it to a collector. There were people who paid good money for antique tools, especially rare ones. Or he could use it. Clarence chose to use it. Let me tell you about the first season, because that's when everyone stopped laughing. Clarence mounted the Sandvik blade on his plow frame in the spring of 19... It fit perfectly. Plow dimensions hadn't changed much in a century, and after a little adjustment, it was ready to work. He started plowing his North 40, the field with the rockiest soil, the field that ate plow blades like candy, the field where most farmers expected to replace their blades every 2 or 3 seasons because the stones would chip and dull them beyond usefulness. Clarence plowed that field in 2 days. When he was done, he dismounted the blade and examined it. No chips, no dull spots. The edge was as sharp as the day he'd cleaned off the rust. He plowed the rest of his 180 acres over the next week. Same result. The blade cut through the soil like it was made for it, which, in a way, it was. Swedish steel, designed for Swedish soil, which was just as rocky as Iowa. At the end of the season, Clarence examined the blade again. 76 years old, a full season of work, and it looked like it had barely been used. Dale Mercer came by in June, ostensibly to talk about a tractor, but really to gloat about what he assumed had been Clarence's expensive mistake. "So how's that rusty blade working out? Need a new one yet? I've got some good American steel, $45, guaranteed for 2 seasons. Clarence just smiled. "Come look." He led Dale to the barn, where the Sandvik blade was hanging on the wall. Clean now, oiled, the steel gleaming dully in the light from the window. Dale looked at it. Then he looked closer. Then he reached out and touched the edge with his thumb. That's still sharp."
"Yep."
"You used it all season. Every acre. On the North 40, the rocky field, first thing I plowed." Dale was quiet for a long moment. "What kind of steel is that?" Clarence pointed to the stamp. "Sandvik, Sweden, 1892. They don't make it like that anymore." "Where did you—" Dale stopped. He knew where Clarence had gotten it. He'd watched him buy it. He'd laughed at him for buying it. He'd bid against him just to make the price go higher. $30, Clarence said. "That's what I paid. How much do your blades cost? 45? And they last, what, 2 or 3 seasons?" Dale didn't answer. "I've had this one for 1 season and it's still perfect. Let's see how long it lasts." Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever seen someone dismiss something valuable because they didn't understand it? Have you ever watched an expert laugh at something they couldn't recognize? That's what happened at the Hendricks auction in 19... Dale Mercer was the John Deere dealer. He sold tools for a living. He should have known quality when he saw it, but he saw rust and assumed junk. He saw age and assumed worthlessness. He didn't bother to look deeper. Clarence Webb had no formal training. He'd never been to an agricultural college or a metallurgy school, but he'd learned from his father, who'd learned from working with steel for 23 years. He knew what to look for. He knew what quality felt like in his hands. That's the difference knowledge makes. Let me tell you about the next 20 years, because that's how long the blade lasted. Season after season, Clarence plowed his fields with the same Sandvik blade. Every spring he'd mount it on the frame. Every fall he'd clean it, oil it, and hang it on the wall, and every year the edge stayed sharp. His neighbors noticed. By 1975, everyone in the county knew about Clarence's blade, the rusty piece of junk from the Hendricks auction that turned out to be Swedish steel, the $30 purchase that had outlasted hundreds of dollars worth of replacements.
"How's the blade, Clarence?" became a running joke at the feed store.
Except it wasn't really a joke anymore. It was more like a legend. Tom Reinhardt, who farmed the 200 acres south of Clarence, kept careful records. He replaced his plow blades every 3 years on average, sometimes 2 years if the soil was bad, sometimes 4 if he got lucky. At $45 a blade, he'd spent over $200 on blades in the same time Clarence had spent $30. By 1980, the difference was over $400. By 1985, it was $600. By 1988, when Clarence finally retired and handed the farm to his son, that single $30 blade had saved him over $1,000 in replacements, not counting the time and hassle of changing blades, not counting the downtime during planting season, not counting the fuel efficiency of a sharper edge cutting cleaner through the soil. One blade, 20 seasons, $30. Dale Mercer never brought it up again. Let me tell you about the collector, because that's when Clarence learned what the blade was really worth. In 1988, a man named Arthur Lindquist drove up to Clarence's farm in a car with Minnesota plates. He was about 60 years old, well-dressed, and he introduced himself as a collector of antique tools, specifically Scandinavian steel. "I've heard about your plow blade," Arthur said. "The Sandvik from 8." Clarence led him to the barn. Arthur examined the blade with the careful attention of a man who knew exactly what he was looking at. He turned it over, studied the stamp, ran his fingers along the edge. "This is remarkable," he said finally. "Do you know how rare this is?" Sandvik stopped making agricultural blades around 1905, and this one from 1892. This is first-generation production, one of the earliest they ever made. "I know it's old and perfect. You've used it for 20 years, you said, and the edge is still this sharp?" "Never needed sharpening, just oiled it at the end of each season." Arthur shook his head slowly. "That's the Swedish process. The carbon content, the tempering. They figured out something that nobody else could replicate. Modern metallurgists have studied these old blades, and they still can't match the quality. So what's it worth?" Arthur looked at Clarence. "To a collector, $2,500. Maybe $3,000 to the right buyer. There's a museum in Stockholm that would love to have this. $2,500 for a $30 blade." "I'm not selling," Clarence said. Arthur looked surprised. "May I ask why not? That's a significant return on your investment." Clarence thought about how to explain it. "This blade has plowed my fields for 20 years. It's part of my farm now, part of my family's history. My father taught me to recognize quality steel, and this blade is the best I've ever found. You can't put a price on that." "Everything has a price, Mr. Webb." "Maybe, but some things are worth more kept than sold." Arthur nodded slowly. He understood. He was a collector, after all. He knew the value of holding on to something precious. "If you ever change your mind," he said, handing Clarence a business card, "please call me. That blade belongs in a museum, but I respect your decision to keep it working." Clarence never called. Let me tell you about the legacy, because that's how the story ends. Clarence Webb died in 2003. At the age of 69. He'd farmed his 180 acres until his early 60s, then gradually handed the operation over to his son Warren, who'd inherited his father's work ethic and his grandfather's eye for quality. The Sandvik blade was still hanging on the barn wall when Clarence passed. Warren took it down, examined it, and felt the same weight his father had felt 35 years earlier at the Hendricks auction. The same density. The same sharpness, over 100 years old now, and still ready to work. Warren used the blade for another 12 seasons before he retired himself. It never dulled, it never chipped, it never needed anything more than its annual oiling. In 2015, Warren's daughter Emma took over the farm. She was the 4th generation to work that land, and the 3rd to use the Sandvik blade. By then it was 123 years old. Older than the farm itself, older than the state of Iowa's admission to the Union. Emma had the blade appraised. The collector market had grown since Arthur Lindquist's visit. A verified Sandvik agricultural blade from 1892, in working condition, was now worth somewhere between $8,000 and $12,000. She didn't sell it either. Grandpa always said some things are worth more kept than sold, Emma told a reporter who came to do a story about the blade. This isn't just a tool. It's a lesson about quality, about patience, about looking past the surface to see what's really there. The reporter asked if she still used it. Emma smiled. Every spring, same fields my grandpa plowed. Same blade, still sharp. Doesn't it seem like a waste, using something that valuable? That's exactly what the John Deere dealer said back in 1968, when Grandpa bought it for $30 and everybody laughed. Emma looked at the blade, gleaming in the barn light, the Sandvik stamp as clear as the day it was made. Grandpa had the last laugh, and so does this blade. Every season, every furrow, it proves that he was right and they were wrong. That's worth more than any collector's check. Let me tell you one final thing, because it's the thing that matters most. The barn where Clarence first cleaned that blade is still standing. The wall where he hung it after every season still has the hooks he installed in and the blade itself, the $30 piece of Swedish steel that everyone laughed at, is still there, still sharp, still waiting for spring. 132 years old now. 20,000 acres plowed, 3 generations of the Webb family. On a small plaque beneath the blade, Warren installed a metal plate with an inscription. It tells the whole story in 3 lines. Sandvik steel, 1892, purchased 1968 for $30. They laughed. It never dulled. Every spring, Emma takes it down, mounts it on the plow, and works the fields her great-grandfather worked. The steel bites into the Iowa soil the same way it did in 1969, in 1989, in 1999, in 2009, in 2019. Sharp, true, perfect. The John Deere dealership where Dale Mercer laughed at Clarence has changed hands 4 times since Dale himself died in 1994. Still convinced that Clarence had gotten lucky. Maybe he did. Or maybe luck is just another word for knowledge that other people don't have, for patience that other people won't practice, for the willingness to look past rust and see steel, to look past scorn and see value, to look past what everyone else believes and trust what you know. Clarence Webb knew steel. He knew his father's lessons. He knew that quality doesn't rust through, even when it looks like everything is lost. That's not luck. That's wisdom. And wisdom, like Swedish steel, never goes dull.